Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. And yesterday, Kemi Badenoch said that the only reason Labour were in government was because of Reform UK. That if Reform UK had not stood candidates, the Conservatives would have won the election. However, the data doesn't really back this up, and it's simple enough to disprove her statement. So why is she taking this line? Well, a careful analysis of her statement may well reveal her plans. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So Badenoch said yesterday, because people voted Reform, we now have a Labour government. But is this true? Well, you obviously can't say with pinpoint accuracy how people would have voted if Reform UK hadn't stood candidates. However, you can test a few assumptions. So using the spreadsheet of general election results from the House of Commons, so I carried out a couple of assumptions. What many Conservatives assume is that if Reform UK didn't stand candidates at all, then all of those votes would automatically flip to the Tories. Now, this is obviously untrue for reasons I'll go over in a moment, but let's go with it for now. So I made an assumption that the Conservatives could take 99% of Reform UK votes and looked at what the results would have been. Now, all the figures I'm going to quote from now on in terms of seats won are very approximate, give or take a few, because when I applied both filters, it actually resulted in a decent number of dead heats. And if you have a tie, then you're drawing lots or flipping a coin to see who wins. So when I say about, it's give or take a few seats either way. So what this produced, so if Reform UK hadn't stood and 99% of the voters who voted Reform UK instead voted Conservative, the Conservatives would have won about 298 seats. Now, yes, this would have made them the largest party, although only just. Labour would have just been a few seats behind them. But neither would have had a majority, and so would have needed others to support them in forming a government. And with this model, the Lib Dems would have won about 60 seats. That would mean Labour and the Lib Dems could have formed a coalition of the sort which existed between the Conservatives and Lib Dems in 2010. Or maybe the Lib Dems would have preferred a confidence to supply deal in return for a couple of policy adoptions, as the DUP did with Theresa May in 2017. But the point is, it would have been Labour in government, albeit with concessions offered to other parties, not the Conservatives. The Conservatives would not find anyone willing to prop up their government. Only the DUP would maybe even consider it, and even that's doubtful given how Brexit has panned out. And if they were willing, what they'd be asking for would be hideous. And it makes no difference anyway, because there aren't enough of them to establish a Conservative government. So no, even with this assumption of the Conservatives basically taking all the Reform UK votes, if Reform had stood down, the Conservatives were still headed into opposition. It would have just been a weak minority Labour government. And another factor to consider is a lot of people voted tactically in this election. We know from surveys that some people, including a lot of Green voters, made their decision right at the 11th hour, in the last few days before the election itself, in how to allocate their votes. And that suggested that Labour would have won more votes if it were necessary to get rid of the Tories. In other words, if polling were not saying that Labour were walking it. So realistically speaking, Labour would have actually, if the polling was saying, no, this is going to be really tight and the Tories are actually slightly ahead, Labour would have won more votes and won more seats. So in reality, Labour may still have had more seats than the Tories, albeit not a strong majority, maybe not a majority at all. But that's the Tory assumption. It's a nonsense that if Reform stood down, the Conservatives would simply harvest all of those votes. There's plenty of evidence for this. How do we know? Glad you asked. Mid-general election polling showed that Reform UK voters, by and large, would not support the Conservatives. They were asked in a YouGov survey how they would vote if Reform UK were not standing in their constituency. Only 36% said they would vote Conservative. There was a further 11% saying they didn't know. So let's run with this. Let's be generous to them. Let us say that all 11% of those don't knows would hold their nose and vote Tory to make like 47% of Reform voters back in the Tories. This would have given the Tories about 200 seats. Huge improvement on their actual result, but not a snowball's chance in hell of forming a government. Labour, on the other hand, would have won about 370 seats. Again, nowhere near their actual result, but that is actually still a comfortable majority. Wouldn't have changed anything. And then consider a couple of other factors with this model. First, same as before, a lot of people looked like they were prepared to vote tactically to help Labour replace the Tories, but they didn't necessarily want to. So they were led by the polling. If the polling had said this is a bit tight, they'd have gone, oh yeah, let's make sure we're getting rid of the Tories. But given that the polling didn't say that, they didn't. Were the results tighter, Labour would have won more votes and potentially more seats. But the second factor is this polling from YouGov suggested that Reform voters, if they had no Reform UK candidate available, it's not just that they'd either vote Tory or not vote at all. 28% of them have said they would have voted for a different party. Now, we don't know what party that would have been, but it would certainly have reduced the Tories' chances in several constituencies. You know, it's enough people to have made the difference in quite a few seats if they happened to put their votes behind the best challenger to the Tories. You know, the fact of the matter is, polling consistently shows that a lot of Reform voters really don't like the Tories. If they couldn't vote for Reform UK, a good chunk of them would have voted for someone else or just not voted at all. So Badenoch is completely wrong to blame the presence of Reform UK candidates for her party losing power. And what's more, she almost certainly knows this as well, which raises the question, so why is she taking this line? Because she's an engineer, I'm sure she can do basic maths, right? Why is she taking this line when she must know it's complete nonsense? Well, it might be strategic. You know, there might be strategic reasons for doing so. First of all, a lot of Conservatives and Conservative supporters believe it. The media often parrot it as if it's true as well. They not only believe that you can just ram the Reform and Conservative vote together into a stable coalition of voters, it's unlikely that many of them actually applied this assumption to the actual results, as I've already shown. They'd have realised that actually, no, this wouldn't have saved them at all. Second, there is no doubt that Reform UK do contribute to a lot of lost Tory seats. You know, and both of those assumptions I used, the Tories would have gained a lot more seats, right? So yes, of course, the Tories are losing seats to Reform UK, even if it's nowhere near as many as they're claiming. So if Badenoch is to chart a path back to government, she is going to have to tackle Reform UK one way or another. Third, a potential trajectory of Badenoch's statement is that she plans to convince Farage to stand candidates down, at least in seats where the Tories are targeting. Because when Badenoch says it was people voting Reform, well, what's she going to do that? She must know she cannot realistically persuade lots of those voters to not vote Reform. So surely the easiest thing is to persuade Nigel Farage and his Reform UK party to be selective about where they stand candidates. You know, because that's what she's effectively saying by saying it's because people voted Reform. She's effectively saying because people had a Reform candidate to stand. So I would say the logical conclusion may well be that Badenoch wants to persuade them not to stand in certain seats. So are we looking at a proposal whereby the Conservatives stand candidates down in seats which Reform UK are targeting in return for Reform standing down in Conservative target seats, excluding the ones Reform have already won, presumably? That may be a more feasible strategy than simply trying to morph into a weaker version of Reform. And in theory, it could have a couple of advantages. So first, the Tories would almost certainly win more seats without Reform challenging them, of course. Second, actually, it could reduce the Labour haul. If the Tories step down in seats that they've got no chance of winning, but Reform have, you know, and that right-wing vote coalesces around Reform in those Labour seats, that helps the Tories as well. But strategy does carry risks. So there's a reason why, for example, Labour and the Lib Dems did not agree to such a symbiotic pact at this election. Lots of people called for it. And it would have made way more sense for Labour and the Lib Dems because they don't even compete with each other for seats. There's like one, maybe two seats in the whole country where Labour and the Lib Dems are in direct competition with one another. In all other seats, they're not at all. So what was the reason why Labour and the Lib Dems didn't agree to stand candidates down in one another's targets when both of them would have won more seats if they had? because there are lots of Labour voters who really don't trust the Lib Dems, and there are lots of Lib Dem voters who really don't trust Labour. So if you form a formal pact, an official pact, you run the risk of alienating those voters. You might actually lose more votes than you bring in, or in terms of key votes anyway, in important places. In fact, both Labour and the Lib Dems were like over the top anal about this. They even attacked the progressive primary projects that were being set up, which would have been beneficial to both of them. They just really can't let those tribal supporters think there is any formal alliance between them. Well, the same is true of the Conservatives and Reform UK, and they are in direct competition with one another. A lot of Reform voters really don't like the Tories, and a lot of moderate Conservatives hate Reform UK. A pact runs the risk of losing voters that Badenoch may not be accounting for. And from Farage's point of view as well, he risks losing some of his own personal support if he looks like he's getting into bed with the Tories. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.